Instead of a song, I have a clip from a video. It's Les Strobel's video or a movie that he put together. It's called The Case for Faith. This is the story of a father who lost a little girl, and it ties in with this sermon because we're continuing in the book of Job. So just watch and listen to this video.
It was January 16th of 1993. In Boston, it snows a lot, and so you're shoveling your driveway constantly. We had gone to the supermarket that morning, and while we were at the supermarket, it was actually snowing. So I got home kind of irritated and said, honey, why don't you park the car over the street here? I'll just clean off the driveway. And our two kids were with us, our son, 3 years old, and our daughter, Lauren, who was 18 months old. I jumped out of the car, got a shovel, the kids jumped out with me, and I asked my wife to move the car to an easier spot for us to clean up the driveway, and she did. And she said, make sure you keep an eye on the kids. And my son immediately went with her into the car, and my daughter was with me for a few moments, but what I hadn't realized was that she actually wanted to be in the car also. And so as my daughter was running to the car, she was trapped on the front wheel of the car. There was a brief scream of pain, and I immediately ran out, and to any parent's horror, they see their 18-month-old daughter under the front wheel of a 2,000-pound car. Was overwhelming. She died instantly, as we found out later. I actually took the last breath that she ever breathed on this earth out of her lungs. And we drove to the emergency room at the hospital, hoping and praying that things might be different, but they weren't. And within an hour or so, they had pronounced her dead. I was given a Bible, my very first Bible, on Christmas, 3 weeks before the accident. And that Bible was to become the thing that kept me alive. There were drugs and various things that people gave us to try to calm us down during this difficult 3 weeks, but it was actually holding the Bible and reading it was the thing that actually comforted me the most. I actually slept with my Bible for about 9 months every night. What I was struggling for was the reality of Jesus, the reality of somebody who knew suffering, who was going to be there, who had experienced this himself. I spent a lot of time actually in cemeteries just walking around and found some comfort there. I could oftentimes connect more closely with pain there because I knew that everybody there had a story, and that people had come and grieved there. It gave me a clarity that Jesus works powerfully in places where people are hurting. And so I found great comfort to just be quiet and listen to him there. And so sometimes I would just go around and read the stone markers and pray for the various families. And it actually turned from an internal thing where I was trying to get healing and hope to a place where I would actually intercede for others. And that was a shift that occurred where God began to do a work that my healing was going to be more complete in helping others. We had 5 neighbors who lived next to us, directly next to us when the accident happened. And within 5 years, 3 whole families of those households came to know Christ personally. And when I think back on where we were and how God used that, I said, that doesn't make it all right, that doesn't make it good, that doesn't make my pain go away, but it does tell me that God is bringing some good out of this, that there'll be some eternal good that comes out of her life and death. The joy is knowing that this is just temporary, that there's something much more. The eternal perspective changes things because it takes the focus off of my experience now and puts it in a different level, a different realm. The Bible says heaven will be a place where there's no more tears or pain or crying or death. Okay, so if that's true, then the hope is that these things will be resolved and that we'll understand, or we'll have more clarity that we don't have now. The greatest hope is that one day I will walk with her in heaven. she'll be perfect. And I'll be full of joy. And this life will have made a lot more sense. Because sometimes it doesn't. But I have that hope.
Before we begin the sermon, I'll read our scripture verse this morning that comes from Job. Then Job answered, "Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. There an upright person could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. If I go forward, he is not there, or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, and I cannot see him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face." May God add a blessing to our understanding of this reading. There's lots of things to take from that reading, or that video that we saw. Lots of things to take from the reading, too. Let me turn this down or it's going to get real annoying. I haven't yet mastered to make the computer louder without screwing everything else up. Anyway, lots of things to take from that video clip. Lots of things to take from the book of Job. I think a lot of times, though, we look at the book of Job and we think it teaches us how to deal with suffering. It teaches us how we need to act and respond to suffering. And sometimes we see videos or we see stories of people that suffered unbelievable tragedy, and our first response is, well, that's the way I'm supposed to handle it. Calm and collect and have all this faith and believe that everything's going to be better in the end. Well, three things that I took from this video that I think are very instructive. One, it's at least 5 years past when his daughter was killed. Probably more than that when he's telling this story. So when I watch it, I think, man, he's doing pretty good for recounting the story of his child being killed. I remember this is years after it happened. And probably not the first time he shared this story. So one, it doesn't teach us how we're supposed to act in that moment. The second thing is he talks about how the Bible and his faith gave him comfort. He didn't say it gave him answers. It didn't say it took the pain away. He just said it gave him comfort in how he dealt with it. The second thing I liked is when he talked about some of his neighbors that came to faith from this. When he looked back and saw some good that came forward. He said very clearly, this didn't make what happened to my daughter good. It didn't make what happened to my daughter make any sense. But there was God working with him and through him in it. He never got all the answers. And even in his last, when his hope was he would be able to see his daughter again, he would hope maybe then he could understand maybe why this happened. I thought that tied into the book of Job perfectly, because that's what the book of Job tells us. The book doesn't attempt to explain suffering. It attempts to plumb the depths of what it means to have faith in the midst of suffering. And it deals with one of the most troubling aspects when we go through tough times, is that it seems that God is silent, or God is far and removed from us. So it's not an instruction manual on how we're supposed to handle tough times. It's not an instruction manual that's supposed to teach us how to avoid tough times. Job tells us that bad things happen, and there isn't a reason from it. A lot has happened since our reading last week in the book of Job, and not much has happened. There's been a lot of eloquent speeches to Job from his friends, telling him what he needs to do to alleviate all the suffering. There's been a lot of eloquent speeches on Job's part, talking to God, telling him that I didn't do anything to deserve what's happened to me. Job knows that the suffering that's befallen him, the loss of all his material wealth, the loss of his family, the loss of his health, he knows there's nothing that he has done to deserve that. And he refuses to say there is. No matter if his wife or his friends continue to tell him, just curse God and die, or just tell him what you did wrong. Job knows that suffering is not always the result of sin. And that was a radical assertion in his day. But it's an important one for us to know even today. If you read through the book of Job, it's best to do it from beginning to end. But it's important also to hear and see that Job kind of moves along in his thought process. At first, he curses the day he was born. He wishes he was dead. Did you experience any of this? He wishes this a few times through the story. But he moves from wishing he was dead to wishing he would get justice. He wishes that he could talk to God and accuse God and say, listen, what have you done this for? I don't deserve this. Nothing I have done deserves what happens to me. And of course, what's God going to tell him? Yeah, you're right. I made a bet with the devil, and this is what I wanted him to see what he would do to you. There is no justice. And that moves us to what the book of Job is about. It's not about the particulars that happen in Job's life. The book of Job teaches us and shows us how to have faith a little bit through suffering, and reminds us that not all suffering happens because of sin. But the last important move that Job makes in his thinking and his thought is that he moves from speaking about God when he speaks directly to God. And I think this is important because it's where Job's faith becomes real. He stops reciting things maybe he knew or believed about God, and he starts talking directly to God. It's a move that Job's friends, or even his wife in the story, never make. They continue to tell him, here's what you need to do to make things better. It's almost a line like if you're at a funeral where, well, God needed another angel today. Or your mother, or your brother, or your father is in a better place. Where everything happens for a reason, or God is testing you. Some of the things that we say when we think we're making it better for the other person. But Job's friends never intercede for him. They never pray for him. They never just sit with him and be with him. They're always constantly offering answers. And that's a lesson for us when we go through tragedy with friends. They don't want answers. Because there are no answers sometimes to why this happens. Now, sometimes suffering happens with bad choices. We all know how that works. But many times there aren't answers. There aren't reasons for why it happens. And what we need to do is just be there for a friend. To pray for a friend. To just sit with them. When I did my chaplain work in the hospital, that's one of the main things they talk about. Is just go and be in the room. Offer a prayer. You can't go in and offer any answers to why this happened. They don't want any answers. What they need is a presence. Someone to be with them. And that's what Job needed too. That's what we need to do when we're with friends too. Just be there. But back to Job talking to God. Job speaks directly and honestly. He speaks in all of his anger, his pain, his grief, and despair because he knows that God is big enough to handle it. And he holds on to God with a fierce faith. He calls on God and even demands God answer him to help him. He laments, and through that lament, he keeps some hope alive. Wendell Berry writes of the relationship between speech and hope. He says, the distinguishing characteristic of absolute despair is silence. There is a world of difference between the person who, believing that there is no use, says to himself or to no one, and to the person who says it aloud to someone else. A person who marks his trail into despair remembers hope, and thus has hope, even if only a little. When Job lashing out, being angry with God, demanding answers, giving voice to what he feels, even shows he has a little hope and a little bit of faith because he's hoping and believing that God listens. And even in that holding on, and that shouting and lashing out, something like hope is born. So Job teaches us that when we go through suffering, it's okay to bring our anger, our pain, our grief, our despair directly to God, even if we can't feel God in our presence. Because we've learned from him how to have hope, if only a little bit, holding on to God with a fierce faith, trusting that God is God and that God hears us, and that one day God will answer. So Job's story doesn't exactly teach us step by step on how to get through suffering, but it reminds us that there aren't always easy answers. There aren't always answers, period. It's not always going to make sense. But Job also teaches us that it's okay to demand questions, to be angry with God, to ask God why, to bring our anger and our grief and our despair to God. Because in giving voice to them, it stirs in us a little bit of hope, and it stirs in us our faith too. In the end of the book, we'll read about it next week too. But God tells Job, you're right. There is no justice. There is no reason this happened to you. And Jesus says himself, the rain falls upon the just and the unjust. But when bad things happen to us, it's not because that we've been wronged by God. Sometimes there's just no reason for it. There's nowhere to place the blame, nowhere to place the fault. And that, at its core, is what the book of Job is about. But the book of Job is also about having the freedom to feel and utter your thoughts. Job is reeling from that horrific turn in his life. And as a person in a relationship with God, he turns to God in the process of mourning. And he wants to know why, like all of us would. Sometimes we ask why like a shy little mouse. Other times we roar it and scream it into the night. But the book of Job tells us that it's okay to ask such questions of God. In fact, the book of Job teaches us that that is the faithful response. And Job, like us, learns that there are no easy answers to those whys, if there are answers at all. We get caught up sometimes when we go through troubling times, we don't feel God, and we easily blame ourselves. If there was something that I could do different, something I would have done different, I could have avoided this. Obviously, if you bought 4 new cars on a credit card and all of a sudden you can't make the payments and they repossess your vehicles, yeah, there's something you could have done to avoid it. But many times there is no reason for our suffering. And Job gives us a glimpse on how to deal with not having the answers. Just like the father in the video, he had hope that one day in heaven when he saw his daughter again, maybe he could get a reason as to what was going on at that time. But we're not promised answers here on earth. Sometimes I find myself when I go through difficult times, if I move past blaming myself for trying to find answers, I think, man, if I only, or I find myself comparing how I act to what I think I have seen other people doing. But then I must remember too that I don't truly know what's going on inside of them. And I must remember too that there is no right way to do it. There's only your way. And there's the way with God. And that can entail being mad and angry and doubting and questioning and screaming in the middle of the night sometimes. Because God's big enough to take all of that. And God's big enough to be there with us. And we know that God knows what we're going through. Because Jesus hung on that cross and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus has felt that absence. Jesus knows what it's like to feel lonely, to feel abandoned. He definitely knows sorrow, the loss of friends and family. So even in the depth of our despair, we can know that God, through Jesus, knows what we're going through. And that can offer us a bit of hope too. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famous theologian, said it in the last year of his life. He said, God allows himself to be edged out of the world and onto the cross. God is weak and powerless in the world. And that is exactly the way, the only way, in which he can be with us and help us. God knew what it was like to feel lost and abandoned and alone. So when we feel that same way, we can take a small measure of comfort in knowing that God is there with us in our suffering. He shares with us those same feelings. It's okay to be angry. And giving voice to that anger and that despair can spark a bit of hope. And as time passes on, we can look back and see how God helped us through those times. We know that even if God is absent, that He is there with us, the Spirit helping us through those times. Amen. Let's stand and sing together our reflection hymn.